Welcome everyone to A Novel Idea. I am Paige Farrow. I am with Community Relations, and I'm joined today by Beth Alvarado and Ellen Santasiero for a conversation about memoir. This is part of A Novel Idea Read Together, our community-wide reading event. And this year, of course, we will be discussing Anne Griffin's debut novel, When All Is Said. Before we begin with the program, a word from our sponsors. This year, as we move A Novel Idea programming online, we appreciate more than ever the ongoing support of Deschutes Public Library Foundation. Thanks to their generous support, A Novel Idea has grown into the largest community-wide reading project in Oregon, bringing people across the country together to discuss and learn about each other through the lens of one book. The foundation is supported by generous donors, including the Oregon Cultural Trust, Lonza, the Oregon Arts Commission, the Roundhouse Foundation, RBC Wealth Management, U.S. Bank, the E.H. and M.E. Bowerman Advised Fund of the Oregon Community Foundation, the Bulletin, William Smith Properties, the Friends Organizations of the Deschutes Public Library, and over 300 individual donors. In addition to A Novel Idea, the Library Foundation financially supports the library's youth initiatives, including summer reading, early learning spaces, and baby packets. Please consider donating to the foundation and the important work they are doing to secure the future of Deschutes Public Library. You can visit their website at www.dplfoundation.org. And so for today's program, we have Beth Alvarado, whose book Anxious Attachments is a finalist for the 2020 Oregon Book Awards and was longlisted for the penned Diamonstein-Spielvogel Art of the Essay Award. Jillian in the Borderlands, a cycle of rather dark tales, is forthcoming in 2020. Her earlier books are Anthropologies, a family memoir, and Not a Matter of Love. Beth lives in Bend, where she is core faculty at OSU-Cascades Low-Residency MFA program, and she has just been awarded an Oregon Literary Career Fellowship. Ellen Santasiero served as writer-in-residence at Central Oregon Community College, has received writer's residency fellowships from Caldera and Soapstone, and is a featured reader, speaker, and panelist at academic and community venues in Oregon and the Midwest. Ellen's essays, memoirs, interviews, and articles have appeared in Northwest Review, Marlboro Review, The Sun, Oregon Humanities, and the High Desert Journal, among others. So I'm going to turn the conversation over to Ellen and Beth, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining in A Novel Idea.
Thanks, Paige.
Yeah, thank you, Paige. Oh, and thank you, the library, for doing these events.
Yeah.
So when Ellen and I were first thinking about this, we decided that we would read from some of our favorite memoirs or memoirs that we've learned from. And part of the reason that we want to do this is that reading other people's work is often the best teacher. If whenever you read something that you really like, it's good to study how the person wrote it. I mean, how it's written. So I'm just going to begin by reading, and then I'll talk a little bit about why I chose this particular piece, and then it'll be Ellen's turn to share something. So the first thing that I picked was Crazy Brave by Joy Harjo. And I'm just going to read the beginning of it because the beginning of a book is so important in that it teaches you how to read the rest of the book and, kind of sets up what your expectations are going to be as a reader. So this one starts, once I was so small I could barely see over the top of the back seat of the black Cadillac my father bought with his Indian oil money. He polished and tuned his car daily. I wanted to see everything. This was around the time I acquired language, when something happened that changed my relationship to the spin of the world. It changed even the way I looked at the sun. This suspended integer of time probably escaped ordinary notice in my parents' universe, which informed most of my vision in the ordinary world. They were still omnipresent gods. So one thing that when I teach memoir writing or any kind of autobiographical writing, I always tell the students that there are the 3 R's of memoir. And the first R is to remember, and the second R is to recreate, and the third R is to reflect. So when we think about a piece of work, the remembering is often an invisible part. It's the work that the writer does before the book even begins. I mean, a lot of times it happens in a journal, but the recreation is the writer taking the sensory details from those memories, the images, the concrete details, the appeals to the senses, and recreating the moment so that the reader can then enter the moment and experience it vicariously. And then the second part, reflection, is what the writer, how the writer makes meaning of what he or she has remembered. So we can see, like in the very first part of this, you know, we have the black Cadillac, and the fact that her father polished and tuned it. So we have an image, a concrete image. And then the next part, when she's talking about acquiring language, is more her reflection on that. So I'm going to read a couple more paragraphs and then kind of talk about those. So see if you can notice where the recreation is happening and the reflection. We were driving somewhere in Tulsa, the northern border of the Creek Nation. I don't know where we were going or where we had been, but I know the sun was boiling the asphalt. The car windows were open for any breeze as I stood on tiptoes on the floorboard behind my father, a handsome god who smelled of Old Spice, whose slick black hair was always impeccably groomed, his clothes perfectly creased and ironed. The radio was on. Even then, I loved the radio, jukeboxes, or any magic thing containing music. I wonder what signaled this moment, a loop of time that on first glance could be any place in time. I became acutely aware of the line the jazz trumpeter was playing, a sound I later associated with Miles Davis. I didn't know the words jazz or trumpet. I don't know how to say it, with what sounds or words, but in that confluence of hot southern afternoon, in the breeze of aftershave and humidity, I followed that sound to the beginning, to the birth of sound. I was suspended in whirling stars. So there again, we have, you know, with the Old Spice and the breeze coming through the window and the hot afternoon, we have all the details of life that bring this moment alive for you as a reader, so you can be there. And we also have, just in the choice, the tone here, we have a kind of reflection, because we know without Joy Harjo telling us how she felt about her father, you know, the fact that, you know, that his hair was slick and he was always impeccably groomed and he was a handsome god. We have, just through the choice of the concrete details, we have a sense of how she feels about it without her telling us. But then in the next paragraph, when she says, I wonder what signaled this moment, a loop of time, and she, even the tone changes. She uses words like confluence. And so here we have the more direct reflection on what she's making of this now. And so one thing that's also really important in memoir is that dual perspective. So there's the perspective of the child in the moment, in the backseat of the car, and then there's the perspective of the narrator looking back on that past self and making sense of events for us. So one reason I chose the Harjo, here it is again, Crazy Brave. One reason I chose it was because she, at least in these opening pages, the recreation and the reflection are kind of separate so that we can see easily the difference between the two. But that's kind of all I have to say about this book for now. And I wanted to now turn it over to Ellen. And I know we were talking the other day that it's interesting, we both chose books that are about family. I guess a lot of memoirs are about family. But anyway, so Ellen?
Yeah. So in thinking about, you know,
folks who are listening to this recording, you know, I want to encourage everyone, if you're just starting out with memoir, to, as Beth said, read, read, read. Probably the best way to learn. And also at some point, if you feel inclined and you want some more help, definitely seek out classes, workshops, teachers. So I just wanted to say that right up front, and that Beth and I, you know, we're both teachers of memoir, and but we're just two people with our perspectives. There are a lot of different teachers out there, a lot of ways to approach memoir and go about it. So, so anyway, be sure to consult a variety of sources in your reading and also in your classes and workshops. So I'm going to touch on some of the things that Beth talked about when she talked about the Harjo memoir. I'm going to read first from Heavy, an American Memoir by Keith Lehman. And his is a family memoir as well, and it centers on him and his mother. The book is written as a letter to his mother, and therefore it has a very intimate tone. So, you know, it's just as if he's speaking to her in a way that he's never spoken to her before. So there's that instant intimacy. He says right in the prologue, you know, I was going to write just sort of, you know, the memoir that everybody wants to read, but I'm going to write what I really want to say to you. So right from the get-go, we know we're going to get authenticity and rawness. So there were so many different passages I could have chosen for this, but I want to, this is from sort of 3/4 of the way through when the narrator he's at his nadir. You know, he's had this physical and mental collapse, and he's sort of at the bottom. And in his particular story, he struggles with a food addiction and a gambling addiction. So his weight goes up and down. And he's at this point in the story, he's lost all the weight, and he's very, very thin. And he collapses because he's pushed his body. He's a runner, and he's pushed his body to the limit. And so a couple things that I'm going to talk about with this. When I teach students, when I teach beginning students in particular, I start with the foundation of scene, summary, and reflection. So I make sure that students have that foundation of knowing what is a scene, what is a summary, and what is a reflection. Those are specific techniques, and you can see them on the page in black and white. So I make sure that students know what it is, how to identify it, and then how to write it. So the scene is pretty drawn out, and it's peppered with summary and reflection. And so just briefly, the scene: 23 miles later, I limped into the house, drenched in sweat, buzzing from endorphins. I stepped heavy on the scale and watched the number get smaller and smaller. So that's just a brief sort of stroke of a scene. And then it goes on: 290, 275, 250, 225, all the way down to 159.3. I was the lightest I'd ever been since I was 9 years old. I checked my messages, hoping you'd call me back. You had not. I took a shower and sat on my bed. When I went to get up and call you again, I could not stand. The blood in my left leg from the top of my ass to the tip of my big toe felt like it was boiling. I told myself if I drank water and just fell asleep on the floor, I would recover. I woke up 3 hours later. I had not recovered. The tenses in my body were colliding. And he goes on with some, popping into summary and back into scene. And then he comes to the reflection, couple paragraphs later. And he says, my body knew that my weight, the exact number, became an emotional, psychological, and spiritual destination a long time ago. I knew and worried about how much I weighed and exactly how much money I had every day of my life since I was 11 years old. The weight reminded me of how much I'd eaten, how much I'd starved, how much I'd exercised, and how much I sat still yesterday. My body knew I was no more liberated or free when I was 159 pounds with 2% body fat than I was at 319 pounds with achy joints. I loved the rush of pushing my body beyond places it never wanted to go, but I was addicted to controlling the number on that scale. Controlling that number on the scale, more than writing a story or essay or feeling loved or making money or having sex, made me feel less gross and most abundant. Losing weight helped me forget. So, you know, just sort of a brief look at scene, summary, and reflection. And even though I teach them as separate entities in the beginning, they are in fact in the finished product interwoven. So in your scene, you summarize some and you reflect some, and you can go back and forth, obviously, between all of those, always holding suspense, of course, for the reader. So, you know, the other thing that I say to my students is when they say, well, what is a memoir? I say it's a memory, reflected upon. So it's, you know, memory's just a memory, right? But once you start to reflect on it, then it becomes a memoir or something, you know, from which a longer memoir can grow. So it's what you make of it that the reader, I think, really wants to know. What do you make of all this, you know, all of these events that you were part of, or all of these forces that shaped your life, or these things that happened to you? What do you make of it? And that's in the reflection. And I think that's where the payload is for a reader of memoir. Seeing each other make it through whatever we've been through.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, that dual perspective. You know, like in fiction, we read to find out what's going to happen to the character, whereas in memoir, what is going to happen to that character has already happened. And so all of the tension and the energy of the story comes from what is the writer going to make of what happened in the present moment? So, I mean, we're talking really about the same thing, that without that reflection, I mean, that's what gives a memoir narrative tension, is the writer thinking about what's happened already and making sense of it. Yeah.
Right. And then, you know, one of the tricks in the memoir, since you're writing, it's a story, right? A story that you want, you know, you're leading the reader through it. You want to make sure that you are writing it in such a way that you're allowing the reader to live it with you again, so that they get the surprise of what you make of it. You know, they see you struggling, and they see the details, like, you know, the slick back hair, the father and the heart, you know, they're seeing the details and the scenes, and they get, you know, it's a matter of time, right? In a story, narrative is basically time, right?
Moving through time. Yeah.
Yeah, moving through. Something happens, and then something else happens, and then, you know, sort of the climax. One way to talk about climax, it's more complex than this, but one way to talk about it is what'd you make of it? What was the upshot?
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to read a little bit from, I think that's in some ways, you know, that's why memoir draws heavily from the craft of fiction, because you do have to recreate that world. If you had only reflection, it wouldn't make any sense to the reader, because the reader wouldn't have a sense of the lived experience, which is
right. And you wouldn't have earned it on the page.
Right. So you really do have to go back and forth between those two perspectives, the self that didn't know what was going to happen and to whom things are unfolding, and then the older self who is making sense of it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is Running in the Family by Michael Ondaatje. And this book was really, really important to me when I was writing my memoir, Anthropologies, because not only because it's a family memoir, and well, in his case, it's about alcoholism, the family alcoholism, but in my case too, you know, there was that element of it, but it was a looking back through the family, going back generations. And then the other way that this was really important to me was that it's written in these little short, fragmented chapters. We don't have these long narrative chapters. And so that was really important to me when I was writing Anthropologies, was to find books like this one that did what I was trying to do so that I could learn from them how to structure my own book. So I owe a big debt to Michael Adashte. But so when, okay, so I'm just going to read actually the first paragraph and talk about the double perspective. Okay. What began it all was the bright bone of a dream I could hardly hold on to. I was sleeping at a friend's house. I saw my father, chaotic, surrounded by dogs, and all of them were screaming and barking into the tropical landscape. The noises woke me. I sat on the uncomfortable sofa, and I was in a jungle, hot, sweating. Street lights bounced off the snow and into the room through the hanging vines and ferns at my friend's window. A fish tank glowed in the corner. I had been weeping, and my shoulders and face were exhausted. I wound the quilt around myself, leaned back against the head of the sofa, and sat there for most of the night. Tense, not wanting to move as the heat gradually left me, as the sweat evaporated, and I became conscious again of brittle air outside the windows, searing and howling through the streets and over the frozen cars, hunched like sheep, all the way down towards Lake Ontario. It was a new winter, and I was already dreaming of Asia. So I know the language in this is so amazing. But also, you know, we have the double perspective, but it's the narrator is closer to his experience in this one. In Joy Harjo's, we have the, you know, the woman who's writing about being a child. In this, we don't feel like we're as far away from the character who was dreaming. But we have that still that double perspective. We have all the rich detail that recreates the moment of the dream and then what's happening in the dream. And it's really interesting because we have two different landscapes, you know, not even just two perspectives, but the two landscapes. The landscape of Asia, which happens in the dream, and then the landscape of the moment, which is that we find out that he's in Ontario and dreaming of Asia. And we also have a lot of clues that this is going to be about going back and finding something out. I think it sets up a mystery, like, why is he dreaming of Asia? Why is his father surrounded by dogs and all of them were screaming and barking? There's something going on here that he needs to discover.
Yeah, more to be revealed for sure.
More to be revealed. So we have those clues. But also, I really did also just want to talk a little bit about the language, and I'll read the first couple of sentences again. What began it all was the bright bone of a dream I could hardly hold on to. I was sleeping at a friend's house. I saw my father, chaotic, surrounded by dogs. All of them were speaking and barking, screaming and barking into the tropical landscape. So we have this, you know, began, bright bone. We have this wonderful alliteration and these really, you know, my father surrounded by dogs. We have the really strong images and then just a lot of alliteration. And so the language itself kind of carries us along and creates, at least for me, a reason to want to continue to read. Towards the end of this, so this first chapter is it's like that page and then that's the first chapter. Towards the end of it, there's another little paragraph that says, Asia, the name was a gasp from a dying mouth, an ancient word that had to be whispered, could never be used as a battle cry. The word sprawled. It had none of the clipped sound of Europe, America, Canada. The vowels took over, slept on the map with the S. I was running to Asia, and everything would change. It began with that moment when I was dancing and laughing wildly within the comfort and order of my life. Beside the fridge, I tried to communicate some of the fragments I knew about my father, my grandmother. So how did your grandmother die? Natural causes. What? floods, and then another wave of the party swirled me away. So again, we have these hints, Asia is this world that he doesn't know, although it's the world that he comes from. It's the world of his father. Also, that he's so curious that he's willing to leave comfort and order to go back to this place that's chaotic and fragmented, right? And then that he only knows fragments about his father and his grandmother, which also kind of sets up the structure of the book. That because his memories, what he knows is fragmented, the book is going to be fragmented as well. And so we know that the task of the narrator in this is to put those fragments together, again, the reflection, put them together in a way that they somehow make meaning, not only for the reader, but mainly for the writer himself. So I think the best memoirs are those in which you feel like the writer had to write this. He had to write this, or she had to write this in order to make sense of something. And so it's all driven by a question. It's not written in order to communicate something that the writer already understands. It's written to discover what the writer understands. And so that also gives it a kind of energy, because just as the writer wants to discover something, so does the reader. So, and I think I've only read a little bit of Westover's Educated, but you get the sense of that immediately, that she's writing to understand.
It makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. I love that you, I love that Ondaatje book. I'm so glad that you chose that. Now I want to reread it. And I'm glad that you talked about language, and because in my notes, I didn't touch on that at all. There's so much to talk about with memoir, right? With writing, with any kind of writing, there's so much to talk about, right? It's a lifelong vocation. So yeah, so in our hour or so together, I feel like we're just going to touch on the surface of things, which is great, because it's so fun to study and learn and listen and about all of this. And I'm also glad that you talked about how, I thought of that phrase, how, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's what came to me as you were talking about how the fragments then they add up to something bigger. And that's that. I see that in a lot of memoirs, and it's something, I guess, that happens after the fact, after you've assembled it all and revised and so forth. You mentioned Educated. I'm going to talk about Educated next. This came out, I think, a couple years ago by Tara Westover. So it's been in the press, at least the literary press. It's gotten lots of accolades. And what I want to talk about with Educated is what I call aboutness. So if any of my students are listening, they're like, oh, there she goes again about aboutness. It's like I never shut up about it, because I think it is so, so, so important. It has been for me in my writing, whether I'm writing a short piece or a longer piece, like my memoir in progress. It has helped me figure out how to create that whole. And it's this idea of you can write and write and write, but eventually you have to figure out, and this is my theory, right? Figure out, what you're writing about. You can have beautiful writing, you can have, just gorgeous prose, but if there's not one sort of aboutness or reflection that's sort of, cinching it all together, that it's not in service of, then the reader is going, okay, that's beautiful, but why did you tell me that? Why are you telling me that? And I mean that in the kindest way possible. Let's see.
I like that. I mean that in the kindest way possible.
I do, just trying to help people, move their project along. And so eventually you've got to figure out, what really am I trying to say? So, couple things that I start with in my classes, we look at this wonderful chapter called Bones from Teresa Jordan's memoir called Riding the White Horse Home. And this chapter, Bones, is just, you know, for a teacher, it is just a wonderful teaching tool, as is Educated. This is just wonderful for a teacher. It's so easy and accessible to teach. So, you know, whether we're reading, the short chapter Bones, or this wonderful short memoir by Joseph Brodsky called A Western Boyhood in Russia. This is another one that I like to use for teaching. Whether it's that, you know, these shorter pieces or a longer work, there is an aboutness, and you can pinpoint it. And I have my students do that, you know, read the short piece and tell me, what is this about? So in the case of, you know, Brodsky, he's, you know, telling us all about wonderful details about, you know, the kind of, not memorabilia, but sort of the detritus after the war, when he was a boy growing up in Russia, and how they, as boys, they like to collect, you know, the arms, the guns, the stuff of war that was left behind, in particular, whatever came from the Western world. So there was a lot of German sort of artifacts that they had. But he's really, you know, so we get all this wonderful detail, and about a radio, and about jazz and blues music that he was able to tap into illegally with his radio. But he's really writing about the fact that he felt like, because he craved Western items so much, he was more Western than Westerners themselves.
Oh.
The upshot, it's not about, you know, the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs and, you know, the tanks and all that. So anyway, so I want to read page 304 from Educated, where she pinpoint, or she lands on her aboutness, and it's not random. She knew this, you know, she's in control of her material. So this is where she tells us what the book is about, and this aboutness, in my opinion, drives every other decision in the book. It drives the prologue. It drives chapter 1, chapter 2, the language, everything. Everything is in service to this aboutness. So the setup, for those of you who haven't read the book, Tara Westover grows up in a very non-mainstream family in the West, and she is not allowed to go to school, but she eventually educates herself. She ends up going to school and going to college and getting a PhD and becoming highly educated in a lot of different ways, in school and out of school. And she's had to leave her family because her family doesn't approve of that, because of their religious and other beliefs. And so she's at Harvard in this scene, and her parents have come to visit her at Harvard to try to convince her to come back to the fold, come back to their worldview and way of living. And the way that the father proposes to bring her back and forgive her is by giving her a blessing. Okay, so that's the setup for this. So he says, I will offer one final time to give you a blessing. And now this is Westover reflecting. The blessing was a mercy. He was offering me the same terms of surrender he had offered my sister. I imagined what a relief it must have been for her to realize she could trade her reality, the one she shared with me, for his. How grateful she must have felt to pay such a modest price. I could not judge her for her choice, but in that moment, I knew I could not choose it for myself. Everything I had worked for, all my years of study, had been to purchase for myself this one privilege, to see and experience more truths than those given to me by my father, and to use those truths to construct my own mind. I had come to believe that the ability to evaluate many ideas, many histories, many points of view was at the heart of what it means to self-create. If I yielded now, I would lose more than an argument. I would lose custody of my own mind. Boom! You know, that's it, right? This was the price I was being asked to pay. I understood that now. What my father wanted to cast from me wasn't a demon, it was me.
Oh my God.
So when you read the press about this book, it will say by and large that this book is about the virtues of higher education.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a theme, I would say. But for me, the aboutness is that she comes to a point where she makes a choice where she decides to retain custody of her own mind. That's, for me, what the book is about. It's not about the virtues of higher education. That's just part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very specific, right? She really drills down to that. And so eventually, when we start to write memoir, I always say eventually we've got to deal with this part of the project. We've got to figure out what is the thing that I am writing about. And sometimes it's the same as the climax and sometimes it's not.
Yeah. It's interesting in this that this aboutness appears on page 304. That we as readers had to get the whole rest of that book before she gave us the aboutness. And how different the book would have been had she started with that realization. It would have it would have robbed it of narrative tension. Probably.
Totally. And as you say, we borrow that from fiction, right? I mean, that's what the fiction writers do. They know they've got to keep readers turning pages. And so, and you have to show that that you earned that insight or that aboutness. She earned that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think she's age 28 when that happens. And she's had to go through all of that, going back and forth between her family and her various campuses. She kept going back to try, of course, because, she loves her family,
mm-hmm.
despite everything, as most humans do. So the back and forth, and finally she's made to make a choice. She's pushed against
mm-hmm.
the wall by her father. Here's one last blessing,
mm-hmm.
and she says no.
Yeah.
And it's just, for me, it's just, it's a crescendo. It's just marvelous book.
Yeah, so that kind of leads us, we thought of 3 questions that we wanted to address, and that kind of leads us just naturally to the next question, which is, where do you begin? How do you know that you have a memoir? I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm really curious with you, how do you know? How do you begin? How do you write? I'm really interested in process.
Okay, me too. All right. Well, so I thought about the questions, and I have 2 experiences going on. One is that I've been writing for a long time and thinking about these issues for a long time and reading for a long, all that. So I'm on a roll. Now. I have techniques that are they're just second nature for me now.
Mm-hmm.
And when I work with my beginning students, I have that experience of, okay, get into their shoes. They're just beginning, some
mm-hmm.
of them,
mm-hmm.
as writers. And so, I can't, all I can say about when I started 25 years ago, whenever it was,
mm-hmm.
Basically I just took a lot of classes. I took a lot of workshops
mm-hmm.
here and there. I had this drive in me. I wanted to write. I had to write. And I didn't know in the beginning that it was going to be personal narrative. I didn't know
mm-hmm.
that. I thought it was going to be fiction. And so, but took a wonderful personal essay class and I was hooked. And that was 1995 or something. I never looked back. No, that's not true. I do a little fiction and drama. But anyway, so just, seeking out learning and reading. And it was like a bone that I couldn't stop gnawing. I had to learn how to write. I had this impulse, this drive. So that's all I can really remember about my own beginnings. But now that I teach beginners, this is a technique that I use with them that seems to be useful and people seem to like. And it's that I have them, the exercise is I have people do a floor plan of the house they grew up in, or any house, it could be wherever they spent a lot of time. It could be the grandparents or the aunts or whatever. I have them do the floor plan. So it's the aerial view, right, of one of the floors, ground floor, upper floor, whatever, and put in the rooms and then put in trees outside or whatever. And then I have them just very quickly go through the rooms and areas around the house jot down the memories that come, just quickly, just very quickly. You know, don't spend a lot of time on it. Jot them down really fast. And I ask them, you know, as they're going, I say, be sure to record sensory details. So, you know, what were the scents? What were the aromas? You know, was there a lilac bush? Okay, well, what did that, you know, so I guide them as they're jotting memories, get the sensory details down. And I also say, who was there? You know, who was with you? Were there animals there? And if there's, you know, they come upon a room where there's been trauma, I just say, just move out of that room, just go to another room. And, you know, you say you're not going to deal with that now, and keep moving on. And so once I have them do that, I ask everybody, does everybody have at least 5 memories jotted down? Then I ask them to circle 3 of the 5 that feel the most alive for them, the most sort of like vibrating. And then out of the 3, I have them choose 1 that they're going to work on just for that class session. Doesn't mean they can't go back to the others, but I have them choose 1 that feels very alive to them. And then I have them move to writing the memory in present tense. So it's that same memory, they take it now to the page or the laptop and they write it as if it's happening right now, and they flesh it out, they add more detail, they can add dialogue, whatever, but I make them do it in the present tense to keep it as alive and vibrant as possible. So then I have them do summary, then I have them do a reflection. So that very first night, they actually have a completed memoir. Well, I mean, a memoir, it can be a page, right? It can be 3 pages, 5 pages, it can be book length. It's just a memory reflected upon, in my opinion. So, so the deal is to get them to do 2 things: connect with the sensory details in the memory, and to bypass the ego, the part of the brain that wants to be liked. So often a student will come in and say, I know exactly what I'm going to write about. Or they say, I have no idea what I'm going to write about. And the floor plan exercise gives them both something now that they've got to start with. And it often bypasses the brain, the part of the brain that wants to be liked. And often people will say, I haven't thought about that fight with my sister in the garage or the patterns in the ceiling of my bedroom since I don't know when. And then they find that there's emotion attached to it. That's why they remember it. And then we're off and running. So how about you? How do you start, or how do you advise people to start?
Well, this is such a great exercise. I think I want to steal it from you.
Yeah, I stole your photograph exercise, so you can.
Yeah. So the exercises that I listed, you know, that I had Paige write up for the for this are really adapted from things that I do in the classroom. So there's the photograph exercise, but you can just imagine a photograph. It doesn't have to be a real photograph. And then, and I often do a kind of guided free writing. I don't have them do the whole floor plan, but I have them pick a number, and then that's the age they are. And then they have to pick a place that was important to them at that age. And then I guide them through, you know, describing the setting, describing the scene, what do you feel, what do you hear? And then a person comes on to the scene, what to describe that person, and then what do you say to each other? So and then at the end, they, because that takes a long time to do that. At the end, they write, I remember, I can't remember. So just in order to get some more ideas down for what, you know, some reflection, I remember and I don't remember. But kind of the same thing, where I first, again, begin with the recreating, and let's just really get into that moment, and then allow it to go somewhere. So the thing is, I think that when you first begin something, you may have an intention, but it's really kind of important to give up that intention and to not try to control things. And then you'll find the more you write, that intention might evolve into another thing. So again, that's a kind of discovering of aboutness. You might think, oh, I want to write about this, but then once you start writing, the memories and even the language will take you somewhere else. And so I always say, you know, follow that, follow the language, follow that impulse, because often what you come up with is much more interesting than anything you could have intended. You know,
Right. That part of the brain that wants to make it something.
yeah, you have to turn off that editor.
Turn that off.
Yeah. So I remember when I was first writing, and that editor voice would come on too soon. And I would write down what the editor said on a piece of paper, and then I would put it in a drawer. Because I was just like, okay, shut up. You know, I can open that drawer later if I need to. But right now you're bothering me.
Yeah, great strategy.
Yeah. Go away. Yeah, and also in my own writing process, whether I'm writing fiction or nonfiction, fiction I begin with a character, but a character in a setting. I often begin by just describing the world, and you know, I don't know why. It's just that's important to me, I guess. So, but it also just gets me writing, and then out of the writing, something else comes.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, I think you remind me of, you know, just making regular time for writing, whatever that looks like for a person. You know, it could be a half an hour twice a week, or it could be, you know, 15 minutes 3 times a week, whatever it is.
yeah.
Making the time to actually sit down for your writing is where it's going to happen.
When I also give myself, so I don't know if we want to, it's quarter till. Do we want to read from what we've been working on? Or do you,
yeah.
or do you,
Did we, were there other questions?
well, we have one more question, which is, you know, what are we telling students about writing memoir right now?
Oh, yeah.
Now. And we both, interestingly enough, we both picked the Patricia Hampel essay to read from. So maybe we should each read a quote from Patricia Hampel and then talk about our own projects.
Yeah.
It was something that you said that reminded me of the particular. So, okay, so let's read from Patricia Hampel and then read from our own.
Okay.
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 So which one did you pick?
I picked one. I am now just opening the file, and I picked the one that's, let's see, towards the end. It's on well, we might have different versions, 135.
Oh yeah, we
do.
do.
Want me to just do mine first?
Yeah, go ahead, because I picked several.
Okay. So for listeners, we're reading from a wonderful essay by Patricia Hampel called Memory and Imagination. And it's pretty old. I think it's from the 80s or the 90s.
Yeah, I think it's from the 90s.
90s. Okay. And so the question is, why is it important to write memoir now? And I don't really differentiate between now and any other time. I always say the same thing, that, you know, it's always important to write memoir. That comes from a person who loves to read it and write it. You know, it's always important, you know, regardless of what's going on in the world. And this is the reason. Hampel's quote here. She says, if we refuse to do the work of creating this personal version of the past, someone else will do it for us. That is a scary political fact. Quote, the struggle of man against power, unquote, a character in Milan Kundera's novel, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, says, is the struggle of memory against forgetting. He refers to willful political forgetting, the habit of nations and those in power to deny the truth of memory in order to disarm moral and ethical power. It's an efficient way of controlling masses of people. It doesn't even require much bloodshed as long as people are entirely willing to give over their personal memories. What is remembered, she says, is what becomes reality. Mm-hmm. If we forget Auschwitz, if we forget My Lai, then what do we remember? And what is the purpose of our remembering? If we think of memory naively as a simple story logged like a documentary in the archive of the mind, we miss its beauty, but also its function. So she gives the political view there, and that's kind of what I think also.
Yeah, oh, I love this essay. And the link to it is or in the materials that Paige created for us. Yeah, and then just to finish that part, the beauty of memory rests in its talent for rendering detail, for paying homage to the senses, its capacity to love the particles of life, the richness and idiosyncrasy of our own existence. So, it says, memoir is the intersection of narration and reflection, of storytelling and essay writing. It can present its story and reflect and consider the meaning of the story. It is a peculiarly open form, inviting broken and incomplete images, half recollected fragments, all the mass and mess of detail. It offers to shape this confusion, and in shaping, of course, it necessarily creates a work of art. So, I mean, I love that too, the fact that it has this kind of larger political importance, but that comes from the particularity of the memory itself. And yeah, I just love this essay.
Right, and the crafting of it, and you know, it's art. You know, we're creating artworks.
Yeah, and then finally she says, there may be no pressing intellectual need in our culture than for people to become sophisticated about the function of memory. The political implications of the loss of memory are obvious. And so we have this idea in our culture already of witnessing, and memoir is a way of witnessing a particular life lived in a particular time, in a particular context. And that's why we need so many memoirs.
We need all the voices, all the stories.
All the stories.
Yeah.
Well, the thing that are you working on a longer project? Are you still working on your longer project? Or are you working on something new?
No, the book length project I'm still working on. Yeah, I'm going to read from the first chapter.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm working on something new, and I was having a really hard time writing. And I think it was, partly because of the times. There was a part of me that was thinking, even though I love Patricia Hampel, like, why write this? Why now? What does it matter to anybody else? Mm-hmm. So what I decided to do, and also kind of what reminded me of it is what you were saying about having a particular time to write. I'm not very good at that. My life is pretty chaotic because I'm helping my daughter raise twins and I'm teaching. And so writing is kind of difficult because it's a going into the things that are most important to you, you're most afraid of, or you most love. And so it was really hard for me to write. So what I did was I told myself, well, you only have to write 3 paragraphs a day. And actually, it's been taking me longer than a day to write these 3 paragraphs. But so I set up this thing. Patricia Hampel talks about memoir writing as travel writing. So the first paragraph has to be about travel that I've already done. And the second paragraph includes quotes from another writer. So that's gives me a chance to reflect.
I love this, Beth.
And then the third paragraph is something that's happening now. So I kind of gradually work my way to the what's happening now. So I'm just going to read you the 3 paragraphs that are dated 4/4/2020. And who knows if this will ever become anything or not? I mean, who knows what the aboutness is? I have no idea. I'm someone who doesn't know aboutness at the beginning. In Rome, in the little grocery next to the laundromat, the 2 Asian clerks speak Italian to one another, and Catherine says, I am experiencing culture shock. In the pizzeria in Paris, the Egyptian brothers who own the place ask Fernando, gesturing as if they're stroking their own mustaches, Mexican? Mexican-American, Fernando says, and you? Egyptian French, they laugh. In Prague, you can get a Thai massage anywhere. Tourists kneeling in storefront chairs. In Michael's apartment complex in North Hollywood, Armenian neighbors don't want the Russians moving in. Carnicerias, panderias, all around the neighborhood. and the Vietnamese bakery with its pain au chocolat. Migrations, diasporas, refugees on flimsy boats, on the tops of trains, turned away at borders, held in camps. Migrants in detention centers, even children. All life migrates, even the virus, maybe especially the virus. Try not to imagine the virus in detention centers or refugee camps. My friend who lives in Rome, his children speak Italian. He doesn't understand them. Catherine's twins understand only that Spanish isn't English. So then this is the next paragraph. Not to be pained by these pictures, not to recoil from them. That's a quote from Susan Sontag. Bed after bed after bed in makeshift ICU units. I think of Susan Sontag as I look at pictures documenting the pain of others. Exhausted nurses and doctors with makeshift masks, with garbage bags for gowns. There are bodies in the streets of Ecuador, a friend tells me. Mrs. Sontag again. Our failure is one of imagination, of empathy. We have failed to hold this reality in mind, end quote, Sontag continues. Or maybe I think it is simply unimaginable, even as it is happening. A single death, the death of someone you love, is unimaginable, incomprehensible, even as you witness it. You cannot stare at the sun for too long, or you will go blind. In the cold sunshine, the twins and I are making a collage in a puddle. Small stones and bark mulch and fallen needles from the pine trees. The reflection of the trees and sky shimmering in the background. Braden asks, how did the trees get under the water, Nana? Julian blows on the small sticks of wood, calls them boats. This is our beach, Braden says. They both keep dashing off for more pebbles, more pieces of dry grass, more pine needles. What will sink and what will float? What is ephemeral, fleeting? Some days I want only to hold them as they fall asleep. That's the end of it.
Ah, that is beautiful.
Yeah, it does feel like writing prose poems or something.
There's a definite thread. If not more than one, there's a definite thread. Oh my gosh.
Well, thank you.
That's a cool exercise. I love that. I'm going to do that.
Yeah, it is fun because it allows your mind to go wherever it wants to go. And threads do reappear in the other paragraphs, of course, later.
Yeah, and it all comes from you. It coming from one writer's sensibility, and you're a seasoned writer, and so it's wonderful how it's already, you're already making connections between the three different paragraphs.
Oh, well, thank you.
Or at least I heard them.
Also, I'm kind of obsessive by nature, so.
I love that. I can't wait to do that. Okay, so do you want me to read from mine?
Yes, I do.
All right, so I'll read, this is the first part of my first chapter, so just a couple pages of the very, chapter 1. Okay. On a June day in 1969, I woke into a moving car, suspended in light. My father drove, my mother stared from the front seat, and my brothers simmered beside me. At my feet was a bag of miniature boxes of Frosted Flakes, Special K, and Fruit Loops. In the backpack, amongst our luggage, the dog. I didn't know it then, but that day I would learn a lesson from my father, one that would both damn me and save me, one that would later change my life. We were going north. We were escaping the Long Island heat my father loathed, heading to cooler temperatures in the mountains, and not just for the weekend. My father was looking at property to buy in the Adirondacks, where he would build us a summer cabin. Hours earlier, I had been carried to the car in the dark, my body like a bag of sand, heavy, inert, my head gritty, grainy, and folded into the back seat where my cheek connected with cool vinyl. Now, blinking from sleep, I saw we had cleared the Throg's Neck, the bridge that connected our scraggly island to the rest of the eastern seaboard, and we were streaming over the Tappan Zee, the Hudson River glittering beneath us. Nature was important to my father, even though he didn't spend much time in it as an adult. He loved mountains and lakes, in part because his father had. My grandfather called the Catskills God's country and rented a rambling old farmhouse for his family in Callicoon Center every summer. When my father was 18, he was thrilled to train at 9,200 feet at Camp Hale in Colorado with the 10th Mountain Division during World War II. We lived in a Long Island suburb, but he made sure we had one of the houses that had a woods in the back and a brook on one side. Summers, we'd roam the woods and catch tadpoles in the brook, and in winter, we'd skate down to a concrete spillway. At some point, my father grafted an aristocratic sentiment onto his root feeling for the outdoors. He aspired to the lifestyle of the country squire, the gentleman complete with hunting rifle, English setter, and a fireplace crowned with a taxidermied deer head. A summer home meant status, wealth of the middle-class American variety. But first and foremost, going north was an escape, and not just from the heat. My father worked hard as a manager for a computer company, getting up early to drive his Blue Falcon into Brooklyn every day. He was always at odds with someone, himself not least, and he brought his aggravations at the office home to my mother and us, the 3 children who worked her hard around the clock. Every birthday and Christmas, when I would ask my father what gift he wanted, he always replied, peace and harmony. When he was in the mountains, he seemed to feel some measure of that. The Vietnam War then, in 1969, was all over the news. My parents could have been escaping that too, or the news of the anti-war protests, but I wouldn't have known. We didn't know anyone affected by the war. I did know drugs were a problem. Officers had come to our school and coached us to be snitches. I proudly wore a badge that said narc on it. Other than that, I knew only family, TV sitcoms and pop songs, my block and school, and Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church. As for me, I was glad to go. Even though we had the woods and brook to play in on Long Island, I felt a growing darkness there. It came from the fire department's noon whistle, a dirty orange sound pumped into our yards and streets, a mournful accompaniment to our swinging on red plastic discs hanging from trees, a reminder that dread was part of our day. The darkness was in the stories I heard about how tough Mill Lane Junior High was, the school I was headed for after I finished at Parkway Oaks. It was along the scar our friend Jamie bore on his stomach from a BB gun. It was in the Mini Mafia, a group of boys my brother hung out with, and it lurked behind the death of Billy Lundgren, who, some say on a dare from those same boys, tried to run across the Southern State Parkway. And it came from our own house too, my father's illness when I was 5, when he laid down on the living room couch and didn't get up for weeks.
Oh, that's amazing, Ellen. I love that.
Thanks.
Oh, it has such a strong sense of place, you know, I mean, the physical place, but also place in history. I mean, yeah, I love the portrait of the father and also the kind of the humor in it, his aspirations, you know, like this English gentleman with his setter.
Yeah, it was a very interesting sort of flavor that he had about him.
Yeah. And then also, I mean, I like that it begins, it's so interesting how easily you get in the family background. It seems like just effortlessly you get in, you know, the grandfather and the father's experience training in the military. And then over all of this, there's this feeling of this ominous feeling that, you know, that comes from the context. So
yeah, thanks. Yeah, lots of revisions. Nature's going to be important in the book, and so, you know, that's part of my aboutness, and so it has to appear early. Relationship.
Well, there's certainly, and then when you say "as for me," you know, like we get the sense of the book is going to go forward into your own life, but here are the things that were, you know, having an influence when you were really young.
Yeah,
I love the brothers simmering.
Thank you. I can't tell you how many verbs I tried. I finally landed on that one. I'm like, okay, I'm not totally, but I tried so hard with that particular because they're,
I can feel them simmering.
The brothers are, they're gonna boil later.
Yeah. Well, Well, thank you for doing this with me. Is there anything else that we should say at the end?
I don't know. I mean, would have been so great to get questions from people. We're not set up for that. So, you know, I guess I just want to say that, you know, to wish people, you know, the best if they're interested in writing memoir, and to seek out classes and keep reading and make time for your writing.
Yeah. Yeah, even if it's only a few paragraphs a day.
Right. Yeah. Oh, and I want to just plug, before we go, Beth's memoir, Anthropologies, a family memoir. Oh my gosh, you guys, I didn't have time to talk about this one, but I could for a very long time. I highly recommend it.
Well, thank you.
Library has it. Once we can borrow from them again, borrow it from the library.
It was many, many years in the writing. And it did start out, I mean, it's kind of when you were talking about your exercise about the floor plan, that book started, I mean, I had no idea what the aboutness of that book was. That was the hardest thing in the world. And I was just writing down these little memories as I was taking care of my mother, because I started writing it in 2003 and she died in 2006. So, and my mother-in-law at that point had Alzheimer's. I mean, we don't know if it was Alzheimer's, but she had a kind of dementia. So they were both just always telling these stories about the past. And right about that time, one of my graduate students asked a bunch of us to dinner at his house. We were supposed to bring our leftovers from Thanksgiving. And so when I went into his house, it was a house that I had been in 25 years earlier. And it was my husband's cousin's house, and his cousin had later probably been killed by the cops. I mean, he died under very mysterious circumstances. But it was really odd to go into this. It was a shotgun shack with 3 rooms, and to go in there and just feel the presence of all these ghosts while I was sitting there with my graduate students, and my graduate students were all talking about where they were on 9/11. So it was like there were at least 3 layers of time in that building. And then when I was with my mother and my mother-in-law, they were occupying other layers of time. And so that's not in the book at all, but that's what began the book, was going into this house, a house of memory in a way, and realizing that, you know, like all these times, at least in memory, all these different times coexist. And that book, the intention of that book at the beginning was to capture moments like that where I could feel layers of time.
Yeah.
So,
It's wonderful. You did.
And so that's why it began where it begins, with my mother telling stories. But I always wondered why I didn't put that scene of being in that, you know, shotgun house in the book.
Well, maybe maybe just a standalone piece.
Yeah, though that was the remembering, but not part of, but finally it was not part of the book.
Yeah, and then as you said, the book is also about memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all memoirs are.
Right.
There, you know, somehow. So on that note,
Okay. Yeah.
It was so good to see you.
It's great to see you.
Yeah, and good to have
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Paige. Where are you?
Yes.
Well, thank you, everyone. So much gratitude to Beth and Ellen for joining us today, and for all of you participants who are catching this recording. I'm going to share my screen again. We have the writing exercises that Beth submitted beforehand. They're available here, so you can check out those, try them out. A great writing practice is always to set a timer and just write. Do 3 paragraphs. There's a lot of great content that was shared just now, so thank you so much for joining us. We also have the bibliography books that were discussed, and you can find these at your Deschutes Public Library. Our library is not currently open, but we do have online resources. We are increasing our audiobook and our digital books tenfold. So check these out. There are many, many wonderful exercises and resources from this whole presentation. And down at the bottom here is a URL to find that Patricia Hampel essay that both Ellen and Beth discussed. And last of all, of course, we'd like to thank our sponsors. We are so grateful to everyone who has supported a novel idea, including you, our participants. This is how our novel idea is the largest community-wide reading project in Oregon. It's made entirely possible by you. So thank you. Thank you again, Ellen. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, everyone. We hope you'll go to DeschutesLibrary.org, check out all of our wonderful programs. We have a lot of digital content there. And we'll see you next time.